Taken from the Women's Aid website. Domestic abuse isn't always physical. Coercive control is an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten victims. This controlling behaviour is designed to make a person dependent by isolating them from support, exploiting them, depriving them of independence, and regulating their everyday behaviour. We campaigned and succeeded in making coercive control a criminal offence. This has marked a huge step toward tackling domestic abuse, but now we want to make sure that everyone understands what it is. Coercive control creates invisible chains and a sense of fear that pervades all elements of a victim's life. It works to limit their human rights by depriving them of their liberty and reducing their ability for action. Experts like Evan Stark liken coercive control to being taken hostage. As he says, the victim becomes captive in an unreal world created by the abuser, entrapped in a world of confusion, contradiction, and fear. In 2015, the Serious Crime Act was updated to include Section 76, criminalising coercive and controlling behaviour in UK law. Since then, additional steps have been added to combat this via the 2021 updated Domestic Abuse Act, further extending avenues prosecutors can explore in convicting abusers of varying nature. There is still a long way to go, especially regarding the coercive control within groups. But someone pivotal in informing these laws and making this systemic change was a forensic social worker named Evan Stark, who literally wrote the book on coercive control. Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life is a key text on my current master's degree at the University of Salford. The title of the course is The Psychology of Coercive Control. I have had this interview in the bank for a while now, but as we are exploring domestic abuse and intimate partner violence this week on the course, it finally felt like the right time to share this very special interview with you. Here is none other than Evan Stark. So hello Evan and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to chat with you ahead of my enrolment onto the Salford postgraduate course, The Psychology of Coercive Control. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, fine. I'm Evan Stark. I'm a sociologist and a social worker, and I've been doing this work on domestic violence for about 40 years. And before that, I did other things. But I'm a retired professor, and I continue to do a good deal of forensic work, which means that I testify usually on behalf of women who are charged with serious crimes committed in the context of themselves being abused, often murdering their partners, or in situations where their partners have killed children, most likely in the throes of also abusing them, but where they have been charged because of their apparent complicity in the crimes. So I do primarily criminal cases, and as I'm sure you know, Casey, and maybe your listeners know, I'm very involved because many more countries and many U.S. states are enacting coercive control laws, various versions of which have something to do with what I've written. And I continue to work on coercive control. My newest book, will be out in a few months, is called Children of Coercive Control. And it basically argues that we should be applying the same broad framework of constraints to how children are being abused and neglected that we have applied to women who are abused and neglected, and that these crimes are almost always committed by the same persons who are abusing the women and not by the women themselves. And I'm hoping this book will have a dramatic effect in shifting the burden of our current child protection services, which are focused largely on mothers as neglectful or drug abusing or psychologically deficient parents, and on the criminal behaviors of the men who are actually physically harming these children in the context of harming their wives.
What an impactful and incredible career that you've had. I really am humbled to have the opportunity to sit here and talk to you today. I've spoken to forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists, but never a forensic social worker. This is the first time I've even come across that title. Do you have an idea of how many court cases you've assisted in up to this point?
No, I'm probably in a lifetime in criminal cases. No, I would say somewhere around 100, maybe more. I also do family cases. We also do civil lawsuits. Coercive control is now, because it's been enacted in about 15, 16 American states, including California and New York, which are larger states. It's very often I'm called on by plaintiffs in lawsuits now because there's civil liability for coercive control. I don't usually accept those cases. I've only been involved in a half dozen, and usually I'll take the role in those cases of simply providing the court with information rather than assessing a client. In my forensic social work practice, I actually do extensive interviews with women, sometimes with children, often hours and hours. And we've been very, very successful. As you know, we brought such a case in the Sally Shalin trial in London, and Sally was released with time served. The court didn't officially recognize coercive control in that case, but it was clear that that was the new evidence that established the grounds for her release. In the last 6 months, I've had several clients who had life sentences in U.S. prisons where they've been convicted of contributing to the homicide or otherwise death of a child, been released from prison or had their sentences reduced to time served. So I think the courts have become very much aware that liberty and restrictions on liberty are critical factors in why children are allowed to suffer in these situations without being protected. They used to blame mothers all over the place because they had drug problems or alcohol problems, but when you looked at these cases more closely, you saw that the women's own protective facilities had been denied, and had the police or had the state interfered appropriately early on to remove the source of liberty denied, the children would have thrived and been okay. So, one thing I think it's very important for you to understand, and people who share this podcast to understand, is that coercive control is part of a larger global movement for women's equality. That we wouldn't even be having this conversation about why are we talking about other than physical harms to women and children if women hadn't been able and children hadn't been able to establish their voices in arenas other than where the physical was brought to bear. So the fact that women now are assumed to have dignity or assumed to have equality, in part because they have to work and they have to provide for their family and they go to school, means that the ways in which those dignities and liberties are denied can have the same status that they've had for centuries for male-bodied persons. So, in other words, if you understand what I mean, so that it's not that coercive control is a new idea. It's that coercive control is a recognition of the new status that primarily, not only women, but primarily female-bodied persons have in the world. And that in order for our society to thrive, we have to provide protections for them. There's nothing profound about that fact.
That was one of the most striking things for me when I was reading through Coercive Control, The Entrapment of Women in Personal Life, which is your big, impactful text that is out in the world, has been for a long time, which will receive an audiobook or has received an audiobook, and there'll be a follow-up book for coercive control in children, which is going to be amazing. No doubt will change legislation all over the world, as its predecessor
I doubt
has
that,
done.
but no book does that really. But there's also a second edition of Coercive Control that will be out in a few months with all new case material and also a discussion of the English and Scottish laws.
Yes, that's amazing. That's amazing, and absolutely something that I wanted to ask you about before we wrap up today. But the most one of the most striking parts of that book for me was recognizing that because women have begun to have some form of equality and have been able to go out and seek equal job positions and therefore in some cases equal pay, there is another element of financial coercion that is playing a role in a lot of situations where individuals are being abused through coercion. And it wasn't until I read that in your book that I realized, of course that didn't happen when as much, I imagine, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, where women were predominantly staying at home.
That's right. I mean, I'll never forget, one of the first men that I had in a men's group that I ran way back in the 1980s told me that when his wife got her first job, he thought he had struck gold. Because literally, I mean, you know, the man was brought up to believe that the trade-off was that he went out and worked and brought home the money, and then she spent the money, and she, of course, supported him. And all right, men didn't appreciate women's unpaid labor to the extent that it should have been valued. Very few people did. But once women were able to bring in the wage, and once women were able to bring in other things from the outside world, such as their imaginative contribution to the household and all kinds of other ways, then their value skyrocketed, not just the value to the husband and children, but their value to the community as a whole. And of course, for some men, that meant hoarding those resources for themselves, and that became in embryo of what coercive control was. That's right, that it is intimately tied to the women's access to the wage and to women's desire to use the wage to make of themselves what they need to do, not simply to make of themselves into the man's wife, but into their own kind of person. And so it is tied to that kind of personhood. That's right.
Thing I found interesting that I was reading about on the internet the other day was the drastic rise in divorces in comparison to the 1950s. And somebody said, why is it that so many divorces are taking place? And somebody else wrote, because women are realizing that if they don't want to stay in a marriage, then they don't have to anymore. And I thought that was quite interesting in consideration of your writing.
The thing about coercive control, though, is that it's not a domestic offense. Unlike domestic violence, coercive control is not limited to the home. Coercive control crosses social space. That is to say, not only through the mechanism of stalking, but women who are single, separated, and divorced are at higher risk, actually, than from coercive control than women who are married. And the use of coercive and controlling tactics, such as stalking, such as intimidation, such as use of the children, such as use of the courts, all kinds of things, surveillance, increases with separation and divorce. So separation and divorce are no guarantee. And I mean, the idea, for example, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this new book on children, because the idea that somehow the coercive control ends when the marriage ends. Quite the contrary. Couples may never live together and yet be totally controlled and manipulated because of the technology, what technology allows us to do today. During the COVID epidemic in England, we would hide people hundreds of kilometers from their homes that they fled, and within days, their partners had identified where they were and were threatening them, threatening their families, threatening their neighbors, and so forth and so on. So the kind of protections that we have to put in place with the policing of coercive controls goes way beyond what we anticipated in terms of family law. And it's true, I mean, women's increasing access to divorce was a major incentive to men's devising technologies of stalking and electronic intimidation that allow them to move thousands and thousands of miles. Creates tremendous problems for our refugees.
Of the phrase coercive control, do you have a tidy way of summarizing what that means? And can you tell us how it was that you fell into this work and into developing this framework around coercive control?
Well, coercive control, it means in simple terms, it means making you do something you don't want to do, making you be somebody you don't want to be. I mean, that's an intuitive grasp of it. If somebody in a relationship is systematically, on an ongoing basis, denying your personhood, regardless of how you define it, that is an abusive relationship. Now, in the law, there is a number of elements that distinguish coercive control. It's not simple. First of all, it's a course of conduct, not a single act. Coercive control is an ongoing course of conduct. It's not like domestic violence. It's not a push or a shove or a curse or even a single act of stalking or intimidation. It's a strategy like embezzlement or kidnapping that has a beginning and an end. It goes on. Second of all, it has multiple elements. Physical violence is important, as it is in all forms of abuse. About 75% of all coercive control has physical violence, 25% does not. But what's interesting is that the physical violence in coercive control is different than the physical violence we learn to anticipate in domestic violence. For one thing, it's not the broken bones that we typically see. That may happen. But coercive control is characterized by violence that is low level, the pushing, the shoving, the grabbing, the belly bopping. But it's ongoing. It's sexual. Parts of the body, it's aimed at the breast, the head, the face. And it's cumulative in its effect. We don't judge coercive control by the fact that it causes injuries. I did research years and years ago that showed domestic violence is a leading cause of injury to women. My wife, Ann Flitcraft, and I did that research at Yale in the late 1980s. It became very, very important in putting domestic violence on the map. But if you wait for injury in coercive control, you miss 99% of it. Coercive control is noted, the violence is noted by its cumulative impact in the sense of the victim feeling subjugated and controlled. So violence is important. Sexual abuse is important. But again, the sexual abuse, while it may include rape, much more common is what I call rape as routine. where she doesn't say no, not because he's physically intimidated her, but because she's been so subjugated that refusal is not any longer part of her vocabulary. So even though she's not being physically forced to provide sexual favors, her options have been so restricted that she's no longer a free sexual being. But sexual abuse and coercive control runs the gamut, from rape to all kinds of forms of harassment and sexual humiliation and degradation. The book is filled with it, and we're learning to deal with it. But the point is that it doesn't look like rape. The victim of rape and sexual classic rape does not look like the rape victim of coercive control, who looks just like every other person out there. And if you wait for the rape victim to surface, you've missed 99% of it. That's why Scotland, unlike England, has a separate category of sexual assault under the coercive control law, because they want police to realize that the rape victim, the sexual assault victim in coercive control, is experiencing that sexual assault on a continuum of denying of sexual rights. But in addition to the violence of sex and physical violence, sexual violence, the elements of coercive control that are new are the isolation, cutting people off from all of the moorings from which they derive their identity, their school, their children, their families, their neighbors, their supermarket, their bowling leagues, their employment, everything that they take for granted and out of which their identities develop. They're being cut off. They're not being cut off by not being allowed to go to school, or not being allowed to go to work, or not being allowed to go to the gym, or not being allowed to go out with their friends. But they're being isolated at these points of contact because their cell phones are being tapped, because their computers are being tapped, because their coworkers are being harassed, because the car is waiting outside for them. So they're isolated in the midst of all of their socializing. He's at the kids' games. He's watching while she's getting the award. She's being monitored in the midst of all of the things that she's doing, where she needs to be free in order to be herself. So isolation is critical. And intimidation, in addition to isolation, he's making her afraid. Again, it's not just traditional threats, but the look and the glance, raise eyebrows, letting her know that he can have access to her pocketbook, have access to her children, has access to her neighbors, or her private possessions, or her deepest secrets. Intimidation that shows that he knows how to hurt her and make her afraid in ways that nobody else does. And finally, coercive control is characterized by the element of control itself. He's controlling her money. He's controlling her food. He's controlling how she does her housework. He may be controlling how much time she spends in the bathroom. I have lists in my possession that I've taken out of families where there's been a homicide related to coercive control, where every item in the house is detailed how she should perform the work. No micromanagement is too small in coercive control. I have those lists in my book. I have those lists. I bring them up all the time. And the judges can't believe that. And the women can't believe it because he never shows any interest in any of these activities. He's not. When did he get the time to spend the time on how you can vacuum so you can see the lines? He hasn't vacuumed in 25 years. But yet the point of the detail is not that he's obsessive, but that by squashing out the last bit of liberty, she cannot refuse him control over the resources in the household, the money, the time off, the drinking, the girlfriends, all of the things that he takes from them. So those 5 elements, the violence, the sexual abuse, the intimidation, the isolation, control, and of course, there's also the psychological abuse. But what I want to make clear, and this is where England really got off on the wrong foot. I mean, it's a long story. I tell it in the new book, the new edition, where Theresa May went from being a Home Secretary to being Prime Minister. And when she brought coercive control with her from the Home Office to turn it into law, the lawyers all said, well, look, the Solicitor General said, well, look, we have all these things already in England. It's a crime to rape someone. It's a crime to beat someone. It's a crime to threaten someone. The only thing we don't have is psychological abuse. So they made the coercive control law in England originally, S76, they called it, psychological abuse. But the point they didn't understand was that psychological abuse, calling somebody a name or making fun of them, only hurts as much as it does when the person is disabled by other means of deprivation and control from responding. If someone calls me a name and I can call them back, or I can walk away without fear of what's going to happen to me, I'm not going to be psychologically abused. I'm not going to be tormented simply because he stays in the room and torments me. Just because I think I love him. Maybe some people can. I know there is dramas on television where, maybe the Archers, that happens, but it's not real. In reality, psychological abuse, the foundation of psychological abuse, is the materiality of deprivation and control. So this is why we're talking about this as a liberty crime. And it's not a simple crime. It's why, even though we've made it a serious crime in Scotland, now more and more serious in England, now in Wales it's a serious crime, and many other countries and US states it's becoming a serious crime. It takes a long time to enforce because they spend it's like kidnapping. It's like any kind of conspiracy. It's not easy to take a person's rights away who's been cultivating those rights and liberties even for 14 and 15 years. They've been getting used to it. To take and it doesn't only. We've talked about men and women. It happens men and men. It happens to women and women. It happens in all kinds of settings. Coercive control is not a gendered crime. What makes it gendered is the fact that the most devastating context in which it occurs is the context of sexual inequality. But it can happen in any context. It happens in corporations. It happens in, in a variety of settings. Probably more than you wanted to know about that, but.
I could just listen to you talk about it all day. And of course, because of the work that I do, I'm linking everything that you've said in that last segment back to cultic environments that I've come to learn about over the last few years. So it's incredible for me to hear you talk about it with such passion, but also such knowledge as well. And you mentioned the Serious Crimes Act introducing coercive control. Would you be approached personally when they're looking at changing legislation in certain countries to offer input or guidance on any of those things?
Well, I worked very closely with the people in South Wales recently when they implemented their law. And we certainly were involved in discussions in England. And my colleagues, Cassandra Winner and Nicole Westmoreland and many, many other feminists in England who are legal scholars as well, have been working very closely with the government. But this is a very complicated issue. Again, it's not, look, Scotland got it right, but it doesn't mean it'll turn out right. I mean, now that the PM has resigned, in Scotland, and we got the vote for coercive control in Scotland 132 to nothing. I mean, that was quite, and we had one of the chief barristers in all of Europe take charge of training the police. We had the chief procurator fiscal in Scotland, really take the law under her wing and we had the wind of the women's movement at the back. And still, it's an incredibly difficult crime to enforce because these guys are incredibly evasive. They have money. They move from one town to another. Police have all they can do. It's not a matter for local policing. Basically, domestic violence policing is nowhere compared to what coercive control involves specialized high crime policing. So the simple fact that all of these things came together is no guarantee that the law will be effective. And sure, we work with them, but it's more a question of just linking the larger equality agenda to these new laws. If we pass new laws, but we don't give new employment opportunities to women, or we continue to restrict their access to pregnancy control, or we don't provide real refuge for women who need shelter, or we don't give them the kind of daycare options they need, women won't have liberty as an option to choose. So coercive control is part of the equalities agenda, but it's only a part of the equalities agenda. And it's only as strong as women's equality is realized. And we could eliminate coercive control with full equality. It'll be eliminated, except insofar as individuals continue to carry it out. Right now, it's a systemic offense because inequality is system.
Another striking part of coercive control for me when I was reading through it was there was a part that mentioned that there's a generation now that finds the prospect of domestic violence being normalized a really strange concept because it's been there's been legal changes. It has become illegal for people to hit people, for people to put violence onto other people. But at some point in the chronologizing of the women's movement, you spoke about and detailed how that's not always been the case.
Well, are you asking me whether domestic violence has always been a problem? Well, we've waned, and that's gone back and forth over the centuries. I mean, there have been periods when domestic violence was heavily condemned. In England in the 1870s, for example, when Francis Powell Cobb first wrote Right Torture in England, it was very heavily condemned. But of course, in those days, wife torture was considered to be primarily in the working classes. Nobody conceived that it took place in the middle class, let alone in the Houses of Parliament. And there were other periods during the 1920s and during the 1940s. And again, during the 1970s, when we did our research, I think there was still an understanding that hitting, physical violence, was still the cusp of the way in which women's insults were being experienced. But as women told us in the shelters, and as the first woman, I mentioned this in my book, the first woman we hid in our house before we had opened up a refuge. When I asked her to talk about the violence, Donna told me, violence isn't the worst part, wasn't the worst part. And I didn't know any better. I said, talk about the violence, Donna. Talk about the violence. So she did. She told me about the hitting and the bruising, and I was, oh, that's terrible. And we put faces of bruised women on our posters and so forth and so on. And then, Nicole Brown Simpson or somebody else, didn't recognize her face on there because she wasn't battered and bruised, didn't get black eyes, but she was insulted and her integrity was taken away, and she wasn't allowed to drive, and she couldn't go to work, and her dignity was, diminished, and, her career was stifled. And Angela Heard, and in the case, so we now put on the poster a woman whose face is not blemished and bruised. And pretty soon, people will recognize that that is not only because it's psychological and physical abuse, but there's also a social dignity involved. That we're not just talking about physical violence, we're not just talking about a woman's right not to be insulted, but a woman's full right to personhood, which is a social capability, not just an individual capability. It doesn't just mean I can be safe. It means I can be free and I can become what kind of person I want to be. So these things evolve, law evolves, justice evolves with our sense of who we can. Our society evolves, and we go backwards too. I mean, nothing to prevent us going back to a time when violence was simply, we were grateful to be free of violence alone, to have a right to wear what we want to wear or have the kind of sexual identity we want to have.
That's the wild thing for me, though, because I turned 30 this year, and I can't imagine living in a time where it's kind of common knowledge that there is inequality in the home and outside of the home, where people will just be subjected to violence, let alone coercive control in separation to that. So the section in the book about, there is a generation now that is kind of surprised that it used to almost be normalized that would happen in society.
Well, look, I'm over 80. So, and I've lived through a time when I thought abortion was a right that women had and it could not be taken away. And now in the United States, there are 14 states or more in which a right to abortion is no longer there. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if your right to be free of violence, when our son went through his transformation, there was a right. Now in many, many states, the right for people to choose their own sexual identity is being abrogated. So of course we go back and forth. And the march is not a march always to progress. And unfortunately or fortunately, each generation dies out. The other generation has to learn the lessons of what we took for granted. So if you're lucky, you take for granted rights and liberties that your mother could not. And, I helped establish those rights and liberties that you could take for granted. So you have to make it so that your grandchildren can take for granted the rights and liberties and even demand more than you had for you.
Having such an impact and making this your life's work, it must be frustrating for you when you feel like progress is being lost and we're almost going backwards in some ways.
Well, I don't know. Is it frustrating to finish a meal and have to eat again? I mean, look, the joy is in watching people enjoy the victories and the successes that they have when they're here. I'm not naive enough to believe that I live on earth for other people. I live on earth for myself and my family and my friends and my sisters and my brothers and all the compatriots in the world. If I could make it better while they're on earth, then their children have the obligation, and if not, too bad. But that's the best we can do. I don't think of human betterment as a project I've taken on for all of humankind. I just think of it as a way to make life better for today and tomorrow. I know that people will turn the pages of history and do the same stupid thing they did 50 years ago in World War II or 30 years ago in whatever war it was. And I'm not at all surprised that politicians and our leaders do those things. And you shouldn't be either. But the fact of doing justice, the act of doing good and making change is infectious. And the march toward freedom and progress over the millions of years we've been on Earth seems to have taken us away from the cave. So whether or not there's one step forward and two steps backwards, I kind of have faith we're marching in the right direction.
You mentioned in your emails to me that there would be an opportunity to discuss your activism work that has taken place around the world. And I wondered if you could just talk us through a bit more of what that looked like.
Well, I don't know what I was referring to. I think I was referring to, I mean, before I got involved in this, I was an activist in the anti-war movement in the US and the civil rights movement in the US. And this work with women and domestic violence sort of came to me when I had to get a job and raised a family and basically needed to find work. And my wife's a physician and Flitcraft and a feminist. And we carved out a position for ourselves. She did as a physician, I did as a sociologist, in changing the health professions in the US to make them more aware of domestic violence. And we succeeded in doing that. We got President Reagan on board, we got the US Surgeon General on board, we got President Clinton on board. And that was one part of our activism. A very important co-part of our activism was opening battered women's shelters. We visited Pitsy soon after she opened up Chiswick House in London. We helped work with refugees in Glasgow and many places in England, and many of the pioneers in the refuge movement were brothers and sisters with our movement in the US. We had thousands of refugees in England and the US. By the late 1970s and 80s, we had swept the globe. We had refugees in Taiwan, we visited refugees in Amsterdam, we knew we had refugees in China. This was an international movement, and we feel very proud of that, and nothing we've done, contradicts that. I do think that we've come to a point in the refuge movement where we need to look beyond refuge, and we need to look at I think the COVID epidemic made this abundantly clear. When people had to shelter in place, it made it evidently clear that we had to establish a sense of place for women that was broader than just the insulation of the individual family, and to define the community of women as an active space of recreating themselves as a larger and larger force, clearing that space of men who insisted on taking away their dignity, but including in it men who did not, but men who recognized that dignity, and women who recognized the purpose and dignity, and making that a bigger and bigger space. So I think the idea of activism and its unification with law and justice has become an increasingly important part of my life as I've gotten older. But we've never not been activists. Now I can't walk so well, so it's more active on the screen. Listen, I have to go because I have a client waiting for me who's in bad need of support. She's facing a life in prison.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Evan Stark, for your time today. I will make sure that I put links to your book in the episode description, and I will let listeners know when your new edition lands for coercive control, the
I
entrapment
appreciate
of
that.
women in personal life. And I will also make sure to let the listeners know when coercive control in children
And
lands
let
as
me
well.
make an ad. Cassandra Weiner has a new book on coercive control that's just coming out, and we're going to be in London in a few weeks to kick off the publication of this new book on the new law in England and coercive control. So look, make your listeners aware of that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely will do. Thank you so much, Evan.
And thanks for your work.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
That is the end of this episode on coercive control with Evan Stark. To find a copy of Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. You can follow the links in the episode description. For CrimeCon tickets, you can do the same. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.